The road ended at a creek crossing about 4 miles below the summit, and Horace Clemens stood there in the April mud of 1883, looking up at the ridgeline and understanding, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, that he was genuinely afraid. He was not a cowardly man. He had been tax assessor for Cocke County, Tennessee for 11 years. He had ridden into hollows where men answered the door with rifles and said nothing, but watched you with the kind of eyes that don't blink often enough. He had navigated the sulphurous politics of Newport, had dealt with moonshiners and land deed disputes, and a cattle farmer once who threw a bucket of something at him that he preferred not to identify. He was 41 years old, methodical, and careful, and he had survived this long in a difficult profession by being all three of those things in the right proportions. But this was different. This was Bald Mountain. He pulled his coat tighter against the spring chill and checked the saddlebag for his assessment ledger, his county seal, and the letter of authority signed by the county judge that he had learned from the accounts of his predecessors meant absolutely nothing up there. The horse shifted beneath him, uneasy at the smell of the altitude. Clemens patted her neck and started up the trail that wasn't quite a trail, more a suggestion of passage through mountain laurel and hemlock, a subtle thinning of the undergrowth that someone who knew what they were looking for might recognize as intentional. He was the 37th man sent to Bald Mountain since 1842. 36 had come back without completing their assessment. Most had come back with nothing. A handful had come back with stories. A few had come back changed in ways they didn't readily discuss. 2 had been turned back by the simple expedient of a wall of armed people standing in the path, saying nothing, doing nothing, simply existing between the tax collector and wherever he thought he was going. 1 had reportedly wept. The official record of that particular expedition noted only that the assessment had not been completed due to adverse conditions, which was the county's way of filing paperwork on situations it didn't fully understand and wasn't sure it wanted to. Clemens had read all the reports, every one of them. He had spent 3 evenings going through the county archive, and he had noticed something that none of the individual assessors seemed to have noticed in isolation. The accounts, stripped of their frustration and their professional embarrassment, were all describing the same place, the same community, the same structures, the same social arrangements, the same fundamental fact of an organized, functioning human society that had existed on that mountain for better than 70 years and had, with remarkable consistency, simply declined to participate in the county, the state, or the nation that surrounded it on all sides. He had told his wife, Margaret, the night before he left, that he thought it might be the most interesting place in Tennessee. She had told him to come home. He had promised he would try. That was 3 days ago. He was about to spend those 3 days on Bald Mountain, and when he came back down, his report would be so detailed, so careful, and so quietly astonished that it would travel from the county seat to Nashville, and the governor of Tennessee would read it and reportedly set it down on his desk and say to no one in particular, "If this is true, there is a nation within our nation." Clemens hadn't exaggerated. If anything, he had underwritten it. But to understand what he found up there in April of 1883, on the summit of a 6,000-foot mountain in the Great Smoky Range of East Tennessee, you have to go back. Not just to 1842, when the county first tried and first failed to impose itself. Not just to the Civil War, which tested what had been built there in ways that left permanent marks. You have to go back to the beginning, to the man who looked at this mountain and saw not an obstacle, but a design, and who had the peculiar combination of vision, stubbornness, literacy, and revolutionary conviction to turn that design into something real. You have to go back to Josiah Ramsey in the spring of 1812, when he was 43 years old and had just decided that the country he had helped create was no longer the country he had fought for. Josiah Ramsey had been at Cowpens. That matters, because Cowpens was not a gentleman's battle. It was not the kind of engagement that gets commemorated in paintings with men in clean uniforms gesturing heroically at distant hills. Cowpens was a January morning in 1781, where Daniel Morgan arranged a double envelopment with militia and Continentals in a cow pasture in South Carolina, and broke Tarleton's legion so thoroughly that the British commander reportedly wept. Josiah was 22 years old. He killed 3 men, 2 with a rifle and 1 with a knife, and afterward he sat in the cold and thought about the gap between what he had been told this war meant and what the last 6 years of his life had actually contained. He was not a romantic man. He was, by all surviving accounts, and there are a few, primarily from his grandchildren, who recorded things he said before he died in 1851. A precise and somewhat austere man who had a deep distrust of abstractions that weren't grounded in something he could point to. He had read Locke. He had read Paine. Not because someone had suggested he improve himself, but because a Presbyterian minister in his home county of Rowan, North Carolina, had a library that Josiah had access to, and Josiah had the kind of mind that once it encountered an idea, needed to follow it all the way to its conclusion. What Paine had done for him was confirm something he already suspected, that legitimate government was not the natural state of human affairs, but a deliberate construction, and that the question of what made it legitimate was not settled just because people had always done it one way. What Locke had done was more specific and more troubling. Locke had argued that property and self-governance were the foundations of liberty, but Josiah had watched, in the 30 years since the war, as the new American government consolidated itself in ways that seemed to him to follow the form of what he had fought against, while claiming the language of what he had fought for. He paid his taxes in those years. He was not, in 1812, a man who had decided to stop. He was a man who was watching and thinking and becoming increasingly dissatisfied with what he observed. His wife, Ruth, had died in 1808. His eldest son, Abraham, had married and settled near Morganton. His second son, James, had gone west. His youngest son, Thomas, was 14 and still under his roof, and it was for Thomas and for the future that Thomas would inhabit. That Josiah finally made the decision that would define everything that came after. The trigger was not dramatic. It rarely is. A neighbor's land was seized for a debt dispute. The neighbor, a man named Carver, who had farmed the same land for 20 years, lost everything to a court proceeding that Josiah watched unfold and that he considered, measured against any reasonable reading of Locke or Paine or common human decency, a legalized robbery conducted by men in official positions on behalf of men with money. Carver ended up tenant farming land he had once owned. The man who now owned it paid a fraction of what it was worth and was, by local standards, considered to have done well for himself. Josiah Ramsey watched this and made a calculation. He had heard about the mountains to the east. He had ridden through the edge of them once, doing business in Asheville, and he remembered the way they folded into themselves, valley behind ridge behind valley, each one more remote than the last, each one further from the roads and the courts and the men who ran them. He had a specific place in mind. He had asked around, carefully, and without revealing his purpose. And he had learned about a summit in the newly organized Cocke County in East Tennessee, a rounded, bald peak that the Cherokee had used as a seasonal hunting ground, and the white settlers had mostly left alone because it was difficult to get to, and the farmable land in the valleys was easier. He spent the winter of 1811 to 1812 in preparation. He sold what he could. He converted what he couldn't sell into tools and seed and the specific equipment of someone who intends not to return. He wrote to Abraham and explained what he was doing in terms that were apparently clear enough that Abraham did not try to stop him, though the record suggests he thought his father had lost his mind. Thomas, at 17, asked only one question. Was there good land up there? Josiah said there was sufficient land. Thomas said that was fine then. They arrived in late May of 1812. 3 families, the Ramseys and 2 related families who had heard what Josiah was planning and decided they had similar reasons to go, crossed the French Broad River at a shallow ford and began the ascent of what would eventually be called, though it had other names before, Bald Mountain. With them came 9 adults, 11 children, 4 draft horses, a milk cow, 2 pigs, and a quantity of tools and seed that represented the sum total of what 3 families had been able to carry or drive up a mountain with no road on it. The Cherokee word for the summit, as best as Josiah could render it from what a trader had told him, meant something like the place above the clouds where the old men speak. He thought this was appropriate, and he thought about it often in the years that followed, because it captured something about what he was trying to do that his own vocabulary didn't quite have a word for. He wasn't running away. He was trying to get high enough to think clearly. What he built over the next 40 years was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The physical infrastructure came first, because it had to. They spent the first 2 summers building the structures that would let them survive. A long house for winter communal living that was replaced by individual cabins within 5 years, root cellars and smokehouses. A mill on the creek that fed from a spring on the north face. A system of terraced garden beds on the south-facing slope that took advantage of every available hour of sunlight. The forest gave them timber for building and game for protein. The soil, thin but not unworkable, gave them corn, beans, squash, and the kitchen gardens that Ruth had maintained and that Thomas's wife, Eleanor, maintained after her. They were hungry in the second winter and less hungry in the third, and by the 5th year, they were not hungry at all. The social infrastructure took longer and was more complicated because Josiah was designing it against a template, the government he had left, that he knew well and had specific objections to, and designing against something is harder than designing toward it. He knew what he didn't want. He didn't want courts that privileged property over persons. He didn't want taxation without accountability. He didn't want governance by representatives who could be purchased. He didn't want a system where the poorest man in the community had less say than the richest about things that affected them equally. What he built instead, piece by piece, in the council meetings that began as informal gatherings around the longhouse fire and became, over decades, the formal governance structure of the Ramsey community, was something that modern political theorists would recognize as a form of direct democracy, operating on anarchist principles, though Josiah had no access to that particular vocabulary and would probably have been irritated by the label. He called it, when he called it anything, common governance by common consent, and he was precise about what those words meant. Land was communal. Every family occupied and worked land that was assigned by council vote, but no one owned it in the legal sense, because there was no legal sense up there and no mechanism for legal ownership to mean anything. What you worked, you kept the benefit of. What you couldn't work, you didn't hold. This prevented the accumulation of land by individuals and was, in Josiah's design, the fundamental safeguard against the kind of economic stratification he had watched consume his lowland neighbors. Governance was by consensus of all adults. Not vote, exactly. Consensus, meaning discussion, until agreement was reached, or close enough to agreement that the dissenters were heard and acknowledged, and chose to accept the majority's direction. Josiah had opinions about majority voting, which he associated with the tyranny of 51% over 49%, and he had thought carefully about how to create a system where the minority voice was never simply overridden. It made governance slow. It made it sometimes agonizing. It also meant that by the time a decision was made, nearly everyone was at least partly invested in it. Women voted. This was, in the context of 1812 Tennessee, so far outside the norm that it barely registered on the lowland consciousness. The community on Bald Mountain was strange enough in enough ways that this particular strangeness was simply part of the general strangeness. But Josiah had decided, in the design phase, that governance by common consent meant exactly that: all adults, not all adult men. His reasoning, as recorded by his granddaughter Hannah in a memoir fragment that survived, was essentially Lockean. If legitimate governance derived from the consent of the governed, then half the governed being excluded from giving consent made the governance illegitimate by its own principles. Ruth had been dead 4 years by the time the council was formally constituted, but Hannah always said her grandfather had designed the women's vote in memory of what his wife had known that he hadn't. Trade was managed by a designated trader, a community role, not a profession, who made periodic trips down to the lowlands to exchange the mountain's surpluses for what couldn't be made up there. Ginseng, which grew abundantly in the hollows and was worth real money to the traders who sold it to the China trade. Honey, from hives that Eleanor Ramsey had tended and that became, over generations, one of the mountain's most reliable exports. Timber, occasionally, cut and dressed and hauled down on sledges when a specific need arose. The trader's role was to exchange these things for iron goods, for salt, for occasional medicines, and for books, which Josiah considered as essential as iron and more essential than salt. He was serious about this. The community library, started with the books Josiah had carried up on the initial ascent and expanded by every trader trip thereafter, was one of the features of Bald Mountain that would most astonish Horace Clemens when he finally reached the summit in 1883. Disputes were mediated by a rotating panel of 3 elders, chosen fresh for each dispute so that no one accumulated judicial power. Their decisions were advisory, not binding. The parties were expected to accept them, and nearly always did, because the social pressure of a community of 60 people is considerable, but the panel could not force compliance. In the 70 years of the community's existence, there were 2 expulsions: permanent, irreversible exile from the mountain, and both were for what the council considered beyond remedy. One for repeated violence against a spouse after multiple mediations had failed, and one for deliberate theft from the communal stores during a winter, when theft meant genuine risk to others' survival. There was no capital punishment. Josiah had considered it and rejected it on grounds that even murderers might be better used alive as a problem to solve than dead as a problem eliminated. Josiah Ramsey died in 1851 at the age of 82. The community council had been functioning for 39 years by then. 4 generations of Ramseys had been born on the summit. The population had grown from the original 9 adults and 11 children to approximately 45 souls, with another 8 or 10 who lived more peripherally, wintering down below but summering up, belonging to the community in some ways, and the outside world in others. Josiah himself had never gone down the mountain in his last 20 years. There was nothing down there he needed. He was buried on the summit, in the small cemetery that every long-established community eventually accumulates, and his granddaughter Hannah read from pain at the graveside because she knew he would have wanted that, and because she had been the one he'd taught to read, and she had become, at 24, the person on Bald Mountain most like him in the ways that mattered. But Josiah's death left a gap that was felt not immediately, but over years, the way the death of any foundational person is felt, not as a sudden absence, but as a slow settling, a gradual recognition that the thing that had held the center of gravity no longer exists, and everything else is redistributing around the void it left. The community was strong. The system he had built was robust. But Josiah had been the one who remembered the why of it, who had held in his living memory the original argument, the original design, the original reasoning behind every institution he had created. Without him, those institutions became tradition rather than deliberate choice, and tradition is always more fragile than intention. The person who most compensated for this in the 15 years between Josiah's death and the Civil War was his daughter-in-law, Esther. Esther Ramsey, born Esther Coburn, married Thomas Ramsey in 1825, mother of 4 children who survived to adulthood and 2 who didn't, grandmother by 1851 of 7, was not the kind of person who appears in formal records. She hadn't started the community and wasn't its founder's wife, and held no official position in its governance. What she held was something harder to categorize, and, in the end, more valuable. She was the person on Bald Mountain that everyone trusted to tell the truth without malice, and to care about the answer without caring about being right. Thomas Ramsey had inherited his father's precision and most of his stubbornness, but not, quite, his father's gift for making people feel that the argument they had just lost was one they had helped construct. Esther had that gift. It was not manipulation. People who knew her well were clear about this. It was something more like a profound and genuine interest in everyone's position that made people feel heard, even when the outcome went against them. She was the one called to mediations that the formal elder panel couldn't resolve, She was the one who sat with young men who were angry at the community's restrictions and talked with them long enough that they either left feeling understood or, more often, left feeling that their anger had found a shape it could work with. She was also the one who, in the years before the war, held the community together through a generational tension that Josiah's system hadn't fully anticipated: the growing attraction of the outside world. By the 1850s, Bald Mountain had been in operation for 40 years. A generation had grown up there who had no direct knowledge of what they had been separated from, no memory of the courts and the land seizures and the slow grinding of poverty that had sent Josiah up the mountain in the first place. They had heard the stories, but stories are not the same as knowledge, and the young men and women of the third generation looked at the world below with a curiosity that was completely natural and, in some ways, completely threatening to everything their grandparents had built. The manufactured goods were part of it. By the 1850s, you could buy things in Newport, the Cockey County seat, that weren't available in any previous generation: machine-made cloth, better tools, medicines that actually worked, and the first intimations of a consumer economy that would not fully arrive in the mountains for decades, but that was already beginning to exert its gravitational pull on people who knew it existed even if they'd never seen it. To get those things required money. Money required integration with the cash economy. Integration with the cash economy required precisely the kind of legal and commercial relationship with the county and state that Josiah's system had been designed to avoid. Esther understood this tension better than anyone. She didn't resolve it. It wasn't resolvable without changing something fundamental. But she managed it, year after year, with a combination of patience and clarity that kept the community from fracturing. She could acknowledge, without romanticizing, that the world below had real things to offer. She could also insist, without lecturing, that those things came with costs that weren't always visible in advance. She had a saying that her grandchildren remembered, and that Hannah eventually wrote down: "Everything the lowlands sell is cheap until you find out what they're charging for the other thing." She said it with humor. That was the key. Esther Ramsey never moralized, because moralization makes people defensive, and defensive people don't think clearly. She made the argument entertaining enough that people engaged with it rather than resisting it. She was, in the vocabulary of a later era, a remarkable communicator. In the vocabulary of Bald Mountain in 1860, she was simply Esther, which said everything that needed to be said. The community she helped maintain in those years was not perfect. No human community is, and the accounts that survive, primarily in Hannah's memoir fragment, in the recollections of Tobias Ramsey, that a Newport newspaper journalist recorded in 1887, and in Clemens's own detailed report, are clear about the imperfections. There was alcoholism. Corn liquor was easy to make, and the mountain produced plenty of corn, and several of the men and at least 2 of the women had problems with it that the community addressed with varying degrees of success over the years. There were grudges that outlasted the mediations meant to resolve them. The Ramsey and Hensley families, the Hensleys being descendants of one of the original 3 settler families, had a land boundary dispute in the late 1840s that the elder panel addressed 3 separate times, and that left a residue of mutual suspicion that was still faintly detectable decades later. There were people who simply didn't like each other and had to live at close quarters with their dislike. But the fundamental social contract held. The council met, the decisions were made, the land was worked in common, and the stores were shared in lean years, and the children were taught by whoever on the mountain had the most to teach at any given time, which was, increasingly, Hannah Ramsey, who had appointed herself the community's educator with a thoroughness that her grandfather would have found entirely appropriate. She had taught herself Latin from a book in the community library by the time she was 20. She had read every volume in that library at least once. She was, in the 1850s, the most educated person in Cocke County, Tennessee, and she was a woman who owned no land and paid no taxes and had never been further from Bald Mountain than the creek crossing 4 miles below the summit. The county had sent 6 tax collectors by 1860. None had gotten past the halfway point on the mountain. The community's defense system was not violent. Josiah had explicitly designed it not to be violent because he understood that violence invited escalation, and escalation invited the kind of organized state response that 60 people on a mountain couldn't survive. What it was, instead, was simply present. When a stranger came up the lower trail, someone knew within the hour. By the time the stranger reached the zone that the community considered its territory, there would be people there, not threatening, not armed in any aggressive sense, just there, in numbers that made it clear that proceeding required their agreement, and their agreement was not forthcoming on matters of taxation and census and legal authority. It is worth pausing here to note what this actually meant in practice, because it is easy to romanticize, and Josiah would have hated that. The community's refusal to engage with the county's tax system was not, in 1850, an act of dramatic rebellion. It was, functionally, an extension of something that happened all over the Tennessee mountains, a practical non-compliance born of distance and difficulty that the county didn't have the resources to enforce. The mountains were full of people who paid no taxes, not because they had a philosophical system, but because no one had ever come to collect and there was no road to come on. What distinguished Bald Mountain was the intentionality. This was a deliberate choice, articulated and defended, not mere geographic accident. And what gave it extraordinary longevity was the governance structure that Josiah had built. A community coherent enough to make decisions collectively, including the decision to remain outside, and organized enough to act in that decision in coordinated ways. In 1860, this system was 50 years old and functional. It would, within a year, face the most serious test it had ever experienced. The war came to Bald Mountain in pieces, the way it came to most of the southern Appalachians, not as a single catastrophic arrival, but as a slow accumulation of pressures that eventually became unavoidable. East Tennessee was, from the beginning, ambivalent about secession in ways that the rest of the Confederate South was not. The mountain counties had few slaves and less of the plantation economy that made secession, from the perspective of the lowland South, seem like an economic necessity as well as a political statement. The Unionist sentiment in places like Cocke County, Greene County, and the upper Clinch River Valley was genuine and deep, rooted in a combination of material interests and a particular kind of mountain independence that was suspicious of Richmond and the planter class For many of the same reasons, it was suspicious of Washington. When Tennessee voted on secession, the eastern counties voted against it by margins that, in some places, were 3-1 against. Bald Mountain had no vote in any of this. They didn't vote in Tennessee elections, but the war's approach was felt on the summit in ways that were unmistakable. The lowland trade became difficult, then dangerous. The ginseng trader, making his spring run in 1861, came back with news that colored everything else he reported. The young men of the community, the third and fourth generation, Ramseys and Hensleys and Coburns, who had grown up hearing the stories but had no memory of the reasons, listened to what he brought back and felt something that Josiah's system had not been designed to accommodate: the pull of a cause. The Confederate conscription officers came first in the summer of 1861. There were 2 of them, with a militia escort of 8 men, which was not nothing. 8 armed men on a mountain trail represented a different kind of pressure than a lone tax assessor. They had a list, compiled from what county records existed, of military-age men on Bald Mountain. The list was inaccurate because the county's knowledge of the mountain was inaccurate, but it was enough to give them a purpose and an official justification. They were met at the halfway point by Tobias Ramsey, who was 28 years old and Thomas and Esther's eldest surviving son, and who had Josiah's precision and Esther's social fluency in a combination that made him, even at 28, the community's most effective interface with the outside world. With Tobias were 11 other people, men and women both, none of them in a threatening posture, all of them armed in the background way that mountain people were always armed, not raised, not pointed, just present. The conversation that followed lasted approximately 3 hours, by the account of one of the conscription officers who later wrote a report to the Confederate district commander. The officer, his name was Captain Harlan Westerfield, and he was a Newport man who knew the Bald Mountain reputation, wrote that the exchange was entirely civil in its surface form, but characterized by a firmness that left no doubt as to its conclusion. Tobias, according to Westerfield, explained the community's position without hostility. They recognized no authority that had not been consented to. They had not consented to the Confederacy or to any Confederate obligation. They had not consented to the Union either. They intended to remain neutral and expected that neutrality to be respected. Westerfield wrote that he had tried various approaches: legal authority, appeals to Southern solidarity, mild threats, and what he called reasoned argument about the necessities of the present crisis, and that all of them had been received with the same polite, immovable attention that, he noted, was more unsettling than anger would have been. He had eventually concluded that proceeding up the mountain would require using force, that using force against a community of this size and this obvious defensive preparedness would likely result in casualties, and that the military-age men his conscription list identified were almost certainly not worth the cost of the engagement. He withdrew and filed his report. The Union came in the spring of 1862. They were more persuasive in their approach, partly because East Tennessee Unionism meant that the federal cause was genuinely popular in ways the Confederate cause wasn't, and partly because the Union officer, a Lieutenant Caldwell of the 3rd Tennessee Infantry, a regiment composed largely of East Tennesseans who had crossed into Kentucky to enlist when Tennessee went Confederate, was smarter about his pitch. He didn't lead with authority. He led with common cause. He made it about slavery, which was either sincere or tactically astute, possibly both. He told Tobias that the war was about whether men could own other men, and that whatever the community's position on external authority, it was hard to argue for the right of self-governance in one breath and accept the existence of chattel slavery with the next. It was a good argument, and it landed, and Tobias knew it had landed, and he went back up the mountain and brought the argument to the council. What followed was, by all accounts, the most difficult council meeting in the community's history. Hannah wrote about it in fragments that suggest she was there and that it lasted 2 days. The argument about slavery resonated differently with different people. With the older generation, who had built their identity around separation from all external authority and didn't see why fighting for the Union was any different from being conscripted by the Confederacy. With the middle generation, Tobias's generation, who were genuinely troubled by the moral argument, and who also, if Hannah is to be believed, simply wanted to be part of something larger than 60 people on a mountain, and with the youngest adults who wanted to go. The council's decision, reached on the second day in the late afternoon, was neutrality. Not comfortable neutrality. The debate had surfaced real disagreements. But neutrality, because the consensus of sufficient adults was that introducing the war into the mountain was more likely to destroy what they had built than anything else, and what they had built was worth preserving. The decision was recorded in the community's informal ledger by Hannah, in language that she kept deliberately dry. Council resolved, by consensus of sufficient members, that the community shall remain at peace with all parties and entertain no recruitment from any quarter. Dissenting voices noted and respected. 5 men defied the council. Their names were Tobias, Warden, Ellis, Joseph, and Nathan. Ellis and Joseph were Hensleys. Nathan was a Coburn. Warden was Tobias's younger brother, 23 years old, with their mother's dark eyes and their grandfather's habit of reading at any available moment. They went down the mountain on a Tuesday in the fall of 1862 and crossed into Kentucky and enlisted in the 3rd Tennessee Infantry. The community knew they were going. It was impossible to leave Bald Mountain without the community knowing, by the systems of observation that Josiah had established and that had been maintained ever since, and chose not to stop them. The council met and discussed the defiance, and concluded, with a heaviness that Hannah records without naming directly, that adults who made the decision to leave had made it, and the community would not use force against its own people. Esther Ramsey said nothing at the council meeting. This was noted. Esther Ramsey always said something. 3 years of war followed. The mountain endured. The Confederate bushwhackers, the irregular units that ravaged the Unionist mountain counties, with a brutality that the formal armies on both sides officially deplored and practically enabled, came twice. The first time they were turned back by the same standing presence that had turned back everyone else. The second time they came with fire, burning the lower edge of the community's timber boundary, trying to smoke them down off the summit. They didn't succeed, partly because the community had planned for exactly this kind of attack. Josiah had thought about fire, given what fire could do to a mountain community, and partly because 60 people defending their homes are a different proposition than 60 people defending an abstract principle. 2 bushwhackers were wounded in the second engagement. None of the mountain people were hurt. The Union came again in 1863, this time not to recruit, but to demand. They had learned of the community's ginseng trade and wanted it redirected through Union-controlled channels, which was a way of saying they wanted a share of it. Tobias was gone by then, fighting somewhere in Virginia with the 3rd Tennessee. The community sent a council representative down to meet the Union officer and explained, with exactly the same calm firmness that had turned back the Confederate conscriptors, that the community's trade arrangements were not available for unilateral renegotiation by any external authority. The Union officer was less patient than Westerfield had been and threatened consequences. The council representative, a man named Daniel Hensley, 50 years old, who had grown up on the mountain and had never in his life been impressed by a uniform, told him the consequences were noted. The Union didn't come back. They had a war to fight, and 60 mountain people with ginseng were not, in the cost-benefit analysis of 1863, worth a second expedition. But the war was costing the mountain in ways that didn't require anyone to come up the trail. The 5 men who had left were a wound in the community's social fabric that didn't close. Their absence was felt in the work. 5 adult men were not nothing in a community of 60, and the people left behind carried extra weight. Their absence was felt in the emotional tenor of the place, which had been, by all accounts, a relatively settled and cohesive community, and which now had a grief in it that expressed itself in some people as anger, in others as a kind of turned inward silence. Esther Ramsey carried the grief in silence. Her 2 sons were in Virginia, probably, fighting in a war the community had explicitly chosen not to fight, for reasons she had spent 20 years helping people understand, and she could not entirely explain to herself whether she was angry at them for going, or proud of them for following their consciences, or simply afraid, in the sustained, quiet way that mothers of soldiers are afraid. She kept working. She mediated a land dispute in the summer of 1863 with the same attention she had always brought. She taught the children alongside Hannah. She went to council. She didn't stop functioning, because stopping functioning was not in her character. But Hannah wrote, in that period, that her grandmother had developed the habit of walking to the summit's eastern edge in the evenings and looking out toward where Virginia was, in the direction the boys had gone, and staying there until the light went. The war ended in April of 1865. 3 came back. Nathan Coburn returned first in the summer, thinner by 30 pounds and quiet in a way that suggested he had put certain things away and locked the box. Ellis Hensley came back in the fall with a wound in his left arm that had healed badly and would give him trouble for the rest of his life. And Tobias came back in the following spring, 1866, after spending some months in Nashville on his way home, that he later explained as necessary for the purposes of understanding what the post-war South was going to look like. Warden Ramsey did not come back. He had been killed in the Petersburg siege, one of the thousands of East Tennesseans who died fighting for a Union that, it would eventually become clear, had complicated feelings about them in return. He was 26 years old. He was buried in a mass grave somewhere in Virginia, and his mother walked to the eastern edge of the summit on the evening they received the news, and stayed there until after dark. And when she came back to the longhouse, where the community had gathered, she sat down next to Hannah and didn't say anything, and Hannah held her hand and the fire burned down, and no one went to sleep for a long time. Tobias's return changed things. Not immediately, and not all at once, but in the gradual, irreversible way that the right idea in the right person changes things when the conditions are ready. He had seen the scale of the outside world in a way that his grandfather's stories had not conveyed. He had marched across Virginia and Kentucky. He had been in Nashville, a real city, with buildings and industry and newspapers and the first tentative infrastructure of a reconstructed society. He had watched a war fought between organized national forces with logistics and supply lines and command structures, and he had understood, in a visceral way that was different from intellectual understanding, that whatever Bald Mountain was, it was not something the modern organized state was going to leave alone indefinitely. The gap between what the mountain community could field in its own defense and what the state could field if it ever decided to be serious about it. That gap had been abstract before the war. After the war, Tobias had seen it. It was not abstract anymore. He didn't come back with defeatism. He came back with pragmatism, which is different. He was not ready to surrender the community's principles. He was ready to think carefully about whether those principles could be preserved by different means than pure refusal. The council met with him in the fall of 1866, and Tobias made what Hannah called the argument that changed the center of the compass. He said, they had survived by being unreachable, but the outside world was building roads. They had survived by being irrelevant, but the census and the tax base and the land registry were becoming more systematic, more aggressive, less willing to leave blank spaces on their maps. They had survived by demonstrating that the cost of imposing on them exceeded the benefit, but the cost-benefit calculation would eventually shift. He asked the council to consider negotiation rather than continued refusal, not surrender, but a deliberate engagement that accepted some obligations while protecting the fundamental things. The council listened. The council did not agree, but the council, for the first time in its history, did not reach consensus easily, because enough people had heard Tobias's argument and found it hard to dismiss. Esther Ramsey, who had resumed saying things at council after Warden's death, said something that Hannah recorded in full. Tobias has seen more than we have, and what he's seen is true. The question isn't whether he's right about the outside world. He is. The question is whether what we are is worth anything if we give the outside world the thing it needs to undo us. We didn't build this to survive. We built this because it was right. If it can only survive by becoming wrong, we should think carefully about what we're trying to preserve. The council chose to continue as they were. But Tobias's argument was now part of the community's internal conversation in a way it hadn't been before, and ideas, once genuinely heard, don't leave. The decade and a half between the end of the war and 1880 was, by most accounts, the best period the Bald Mountain community ever had, which makes what happened afterward carry the particular weight of things lost at their height. Cocky County in the early 1870s was a wreck. Reconstruction Tennessee was a complicated disaster of competing interests. The freed people trying to establish lives with no land and few legal protections. The former Confederates reasserting control wherever they could. The Unionists discovering that loyalty to the federal government did not translate into federal investment in the mountains and a state government trying to manage it all with resources that were inadequate to begin with. In this environment, the county government had neither the attention nor the capacity to pursue an isolated mountain community that had never been directly threatening to anyone. The tax collectors stayed away. The census men, in 1870, sent their forms to what addresses they had and did not follow up when the forms were not returned. The mountain had peace, and in peace it flourished. The school was the most tangible expression of this. Hannah Ramsey had been teaching the community's children informally for years, but in 1871, she formalized it, built a schoolhouse, drew up a curriculum, established regular hours, and began conducting what was, by any reasonable measure, a better education than anything available in Newport or most of the surrounding towns. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and natural philosophy. She taught from the community's library, which by 1871 contained over 200 volumes acquired over 60 years of trader runs. She had students of every age from 6 to adult, because several of the older community members who had had only sporadic education wanted to participate. She was, by 1875, corresponding, through the lowland merchant gentry, with a teacher in Asheville who had heard of her school through the informal networks of mountain culture and wanted to trade lesson plans. Gentry was the other new element of this period. His full name was Robert Gentry, and he ran a dry goods store in a crossroads community about 15 miles from the base of Bald Mountain that had been doing business with the mountain people since the 1840s in the limited way that mountain trade allowed. What changed in the early 1870s was that Gentry decided to invest in the relationship more deliberately. He extended credit, which the mountain community didn't use in the debt sense, but which meant Gentry would hold goods for them. And he began to actively seek their products, particularly the ginseng and honey, but also the wood carvings and the woven goods that the mountain women produced with a quality that Gentry's customers in the lowlands, and increasingly in Asheville, were willing to pay for. The community benefited materially from this relationship in ways that eased the generational tension about manufactured goods. With consistent trade income, they could buy more of what they wanted from the outside world without the full integration that cash employment in the lowland economy would have required. It was, for a few years, a remarkable balance, the benefits of exchange without the loss of autonomy. Hannah wrote about these years with a warmth that her writing rarely achieved elsewhere. She was in her 40s by then, self-educated to a level that astonished the occasional lowlander who had contact with her, unmarried by choice, in a community that didn't pressure her about it, and the mountain's primary intellectual conscience in a way that her grandfather had been in his time. She describes the 1870s in fragments of her memoir with a quality of autumn light, beautiful and characterized by the peculiar awareness of beautiful things that you feel when you know the season is ending. She wasn't wrong. The cracks were there if you looked. The younger generation, the fourth generation now, born entirely on the mountain, knowing the outside world only through books and traders' reports and the occasional glimpse from the summit of the valley below, was more restless than the generation before it. The manufactured goods were more available now and more desirable, and the argument that you could have them through mountain trade was becoming less convincing as the range and quantity of what the cash economy offered expanded. Several young people had gone down to the lowlands for months at a time, returning with experiences that the community's consensus system had trouble incorporating. The council could not require adults to stay. It never had. But adults who spent significant time in the lowlands were changed by it, and the community absorbed those changes with increasing difficulty. The consensus problem was also real. 60 people making decisions by consensus was manageable when 60 people had been raised in the same system and shared, with minor variations, the same values and the same understanding of what the community was for. As the community grew slightly and as the generational memory of the original founding rationale became more diluted, the consensus got harder. Not broken, the system still functioned, but slower, more contested, more likely to produce the uncomfortable compromise that satisfies everyone slightly, rather than the genuine agreement that satisfies everyone deeply. Josiah had designed against the tyranny of the majority. He hadn't fully solved the tyranny of the difficult meeting, and the difficult meeting was becoming more common. Tobias, meanwhile, had not stopped thinking. He was in his late 40s by now, one of the community's most respected figures, on the basis of both his experience and his obvious intelligence, and he continued to make the pragmatic case, carefully, without forcing it, that the outside world was not going to remain as conveniently distracted as it had been. The 1880 census, he said, was going to be different. The post-war federal government was building institutions, a real census bureau, systematic land registries, tax enforcement structures that were qualitatively different from what had existed before. The blank space on the county map that was Bald Mountain was going to become visible to people with the power to care about it. He was right about this too. He was right about a lot of things, and being right about things that people didn't want to hear is a particular kind of loneliness. And then, in the winter of 1878, Esther Ramsey died. She was 76 years old, which was a long life in the mountains in 1878. She had been in declining health for 2 years, and the community had adjusted around it in the way that communities adjust around the failing health of important people. More attention, more care, and the quiet dread of the adjustment that is coming. She died in the longhouse, which was still used for communal gathering, even though everyone had individual cabins now, in the middle of a February night, with 2 of her grandchildren beside her, and the sound of the wind off the eastern face of the mountain, doing what the wind on that mountain always did. The council met 3 days after she was buried to discuss 2 land boundary questions that had been pending for weeks. The meeting lasted 6 hours and settled nothing. The mediator, a man named Silas Hensley, Daniel's son, who had done this work capably for years, was good at his job, but found himself unable to find the language that usually closed these discussions. The parties left, frustrated. The questions were deferred. Hannah wrote in her memoir, "The stone that held the arch was gone. The arch still stands for now, but you can feel the change in it. Over the next 2 years, the arch settled. The council meetings ran longer. Sub-factions formed around the old Ramsey-Hensley fault line that had never fully healed after the 1840s boundary dispute, and around the newer fault line between those who agreed with Tobias's pragmatic integration argument and those who held to the original refusal. The school continued. Hannah was too determined for it not to. But 3 of the young adults who had always been most involved in teaching assistants went down to the lowlands in 1879 and 1880 and didn't come back, and the hole they left was covered but not filled. The 1880 census came, as Tobias had predicted, with a different seriousness than before. The Federal Census Bureau had instructions. The county was expected to achieve substantially complete enumeration. There was, for the first time, genuine pressure from the state level for Cocke County to account for the blank space on its population map. The first census enumerator sent to Bald Mountain came back within a day. He had not even made it to the halfway point before being redirected, and the county agent who supervised him filed a frustrated report to Nashville saying that this had been the situation for 40 years and no one had ever done anything about it, and he would appreciate guidance. Nashville sent guidance. It came in the form of a directive from the State Revenue Office noting that unassessed property and unenumerated population in Cocke County represented a compliance problem that was now a matter of state record, and that the county was expected to resolve it. The county, recognizing that its previous approach of polite avoidance was no longer available, did what government offices have always done when faced with a problem they know is real but can't immediately solve. They assigned it to the most competent person available and waited to see what happened. That person was Horace Clemens. Clemens reached the first visible structure of the Bald Mountain community on the morning of the second day of his ascent, having spent the previous night in a rough camp at the creek crossing. It was a storage shed, built of hewn timber with a dovetail corner joint that he noted, in his ledger, was of a quality exceeding most construction I have observed in this county. Behind it were garden beds, terraced and dormant in April, but laid out with a precision that suggested long experience. The trail he was following, he had found the actual trail by the second morning, having spent most of the first day on a false path that he suspected was intentional, widened here into something that could almost be called a lane. He was not surprised to find 3 people waiting for him. 2 men and a woman, all of them older than him, all of them with the particular quality of stillness that he would come to associate with everyone he met on the mountain. None of them appeared to be armed, though he had no doubt that the absence was technical rather than actual. The woman spoke first. She was Hannah Ramsey. She was 56 years old, with white hair and the kind of dark eyes that he would describe, in his report, as possessing an intelligence that made ordinary social performance seem unnecessary. She introduced herself by name and introduced the 2 men, her cousin James Ramsey and a Hensley whose first name Clemens didn't catch, and she asked him with perfect courtesy to explain his purpose. He explained it. She listened without interruption. She asked 3 questions. What specific authority did he represent? What were the consequences of non-compliance? And was he willing to hear the community's position before making any demands? He said yes to all 3 questions, which he would later write was the decision that made everything that followed possible. She brought him up the mountain. The summit of Bald Mountain in April, 1883, was, in Clemens's account, more than he had expected, and different from what he had imagined. He had expected something rough and improvised, the kind of subsistence settlement that the mountain reputation suggested. What he found was a community of approximately 55 resident adults and children, with an additional 8 or 10 peripherally affiliated, organized around a settlement of 17 structures that included individual family cabins, shared workshops, a library schoolhouse, a smokehouse, root cellars, a mill house, and, at the center of the settlement, in a clearing on the summit's highest point, the council house. The council house was 30 feet across and circular. The stones of its foundation were laid in a ring with no gap for a head position, no elevated platform, no architectural indication of precedence. Every seat faced the center. Josiah had designed it that way in 1815, and it had been built and rebuilt twice since then, always to the same design. Clemens spent several minutes at it before Hannah, who had been watching him, said, "My grandfather believed that the shape of a room teaches people what to do in it. A circle teaches equality. A long table teaches hierarchy." Clemens wrote in his ledger, "Circle, 30 feet, no head. Every stone faces center. Note this." He spent 3 days on the mountain. Not all of that time was comfortable. There were community members who made no secret of their wish that he had not been admitted, and the Hensley faction in particular watched him with a wariness that never entirely relaxed. But he was fed well, given a place to sleep that was better than his camp at the creek, and granted, at Hannah's insistence and over some apparent objection, access to the community library, the council ledgers, and several hours of conversation with Tobias Ramsey, who was 60 by now, and who turned out to be exactly what Clemens had been told to expect, the most pragmatically clear-eyed person he had ever spoken with about the relationship between community and state. Tobias told him, in those conversations, what the community was and where it came from and how it functioned. He was unsentimental about its flaws. He itemized them, the alcohol problems, and the faction tensions, and the difficulty of the consensus system under demographic pressure. And he was clear-eyed about its achievements. A community of 60 people, he told Clemens, that had maintained genuine democratic governance for 70 years, that had educated its children to a standard the county couldn't match, that had managed land communally without the accumulation of poverty, that had achieved by its own devices a level of social equity that the surrounding county's legal structures had never approached. This was not nothing. This was, in fact, a meaningful achievement that deserved to be taken seriously. Clemens asked him, what did the community want? Tobias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, to be left alone, as they had been. But that answer, he acknowledged, was no longer available. The state was building roads through the mountains. The census was becoming systematic. The tax registry was becoming complete. The geography that had protected them was being reduced by technology and will. What the community wanted and what the community could have were not the same thing anymore. What they might be able to negotiate, Tobias said, was a transition that preserved the essential things: the communal land arrangement, the school, the council governance. If those could be protected within some framework that satisfied the state's need for a census count and a tax record, if those things could be managed without introducing the legal instruments of private property that would unravel everything else, then perhaps there was a conversation to be had. Clemens listened and wrote and thought. He spent the third morning with Hannah in the library schoolhouse, watching her teach a class of 7 children ranging in age from 6 to 15, using a curriculum that he estimated was equivalent to the best rural schooling he had seen in Tennessee, and probably better than average. He spent the third afternoon walking the community's land with James Ramsey, who showed him the terraced gardens and the mill, and the honey operation that was, by Clemens's observation, considerably more sophisticated than anything he'd seen in the lowlands. He spent the third evening at the council house, where the full community assembled, all the adults plus older children, and where he was given an opportunity to speak, which he took carefully, explaining as honestly as he could what the county and state wanted and what the likely consequences of continued non-compliance would be. The assembly listened. There was no shouting. The council culture was one of controlled discussion, and Clemens's presence made everyone perform the best version of that culture. But there was an intensity that he could feel. The questions were sharp. A woman of perhaps 30, whose name he didn't catch, asked him whether the county had ever provided any service to the community in exchange for the taxes it was now proposing to collect. He said honestly that he couldn't identify one. She said, "Then what exactly was being proposed here?" He said, "The state's claim was territorial, not transactional. It asserted authority regardless of service provision." She said, "Yes, exactly. That's what we've been saying for 70 years. He didn't have a good answer for that. He wrote in his report that he did not have a good answer for it. He left on the morning of the fourth day, carrying his ledger and his report and something else that he couldn't quite name. A quality of discomfort that, he eventually decided, was the feeling of having encountered a genuine challenge to premises he had never thought to examine. His report reached the county judge's desk in late April and was forwarded to Nashville in May. The governor's office requested a full briefing. Clemens traveled to Nashville in June and sat across a desk from a deputy to the governor and explained what he had seen in careful, methodical detail, the way he always did things. The deputy asked questions. The questions were mostly about defensibility, by which he meant military defensibility. Could the state enforce its authority there if it chose to? Clemens said yes, eventually, with significant effort and probably some violence. The deputy asked whether the violence would be worth the political cost. Clemens said that was above his pay grade, which made the deputy smile thinly. What the state eventually decided, after months of internal discussion that Clemens wasn't privy to, but that he pieced together later from rumor and official correspondence, was to send the Tennessee State Guard, not for enforcement officially, for survey. The stated purpose was to conduct a geographic survey of the mountain for potential road planning, which was true in the sense that road planning was indeed part of the state's longer-term agenda for the region, and false in the sense that everyone involved understood that a survey team with a military escort on Bald Mountain was not primarily about roads. The survey party arrived at the base of the mountain in September of 1883. It consisted of 6 state guardsmen, 2 civilian surveyors from Nashville, and a county official named Fitch, who had been assigned as the county's representative. They were not aggressive. They were polite and official, and persistent in a way that the community's previous encounters with external authority had not been, because previous authorities had eventually concluded that the cost of persistence exceeded the value. These men persisted because they had been told to persist, because there was now a formal record of the mountain's non-compliance and because the state's tolerance for blank spaces on its map had run out. The community met them at the halfway point, as they had met everyone for 40 years. The same standing presence, the same calm, armed non-menace. Tobias was there, and Hannah, and 3 others. The State Guard lieutenant, a young man named Addison, who was clearly following instructions he hadn't written, read them a formal notice asserting the state's authority to conduct surveys on all lands within Tennessee's jurisdiction and indicating that interference would constitute an offense against the state. Tobias received the notice and asked for 3 days to bring it to the council. The lieutenant agreed, on the condition that the survey party was permitted to establish a camp at the halfway point during those 3 days. Tobias agreed to that. The parties separated. The 3 days began. The council meeting that followed was not the worst in the community's history, but it was close. What made it worse than the Civil War conscription debate was not the external pressure. That had been significant too, but the internal division, which was now deeper, older, and more painful. Tobias's faction, the pragmatists who had been arguing for negotiated accommodation since 1866, had been growing for years. Esther's death had removed the most effective opponent of accommodation, not because Esther had been opposed to negotiation in principle, but because she had been the one who found the language to make the refusal position feel like principle rather than stubbornness. Without her, the refusal argument was harder to sustain at the emotional level that it needed to operate at. The refusal faction was led, in 1883, by a man named Caleb Hensley, Daniel's grandson, who was 40 years old and who had inherited his family's suspicion of the Ramsey line, along with a genuine and articulate commitment to the community's founding principles. Caleb was not wrong in his arguments. He made, in that 3-day council, a case that Hannah recorded in full and that stands up to examination. The state had never done anything for them. The state's authority was claimed, not earned. Accepting a survey was the first step in a sequence that had a predictable end. Once private land registration was introduced, the communal system would collapse within a generation because the economic incentives of private property would erode the social cohesion that made communal management work. He was right about every one of those things. The tragedy is not that he was wrong, but that he was right, and it didn't matter. The vote. They voted this time because the consensus process had broken down, was 31 to 29 to accept Tobias's proposal, permit the survey, open negotiations with the county for a land and tax arrangement that would preserve as much of the internal system as possible. The specific terms that Tobias had developed in consultation with Clemens through Gentry involved formal census participation in exchange for recognition of the community's existing land arrangements, a nominal tax payment in exchange for a formal guarantee of the school's operation, and a recorded acknowledgement of the community's council governance as the legal authority for internal disputes. It was, as these things go, a reasonable deal. It preserved more than most such negotiations preserve. And it was, as Caleb Hensley said at the final council session, in language that Hannah wrote down verbatim. A door opened for reasons that seemed good, through which everything we are will eventually walk out and not come back. The survey proceeded in October 1883. It was the first official government activity on Bald Mountain's summit in 70 years. The surveyors were professional and quick about it. and Clemens, who had returned with the party at his own request, and somewhat to everyone's surprise, kept his notes carefully and spent one afternoon in the library with Hannah, trading book recommendations and discussing Locke in a conversation that he later said was the best intellectual exchange of his life. The State Guard lieutenant was notably less comfortable on the mountain than Clemens. The place unnerved him in ways he couldn't entirely articulate, which is perhaps what happens when you spend 3 days surrounded by a functioning society that operates by rules you've been trained to regard as illegitimate. The land registration came in 1884. Tobias worked through it with the county's land office, and the result was a set of recorded deeds that reflected the community's existing arrangement as closely as the legal system's categories would allow. The communal land was registered in parcels assigned to individual family heads, with a recorded covenant that they were to be managed in common, a legal arrangement that the county office accepted with some puzzlement, and the tax assessors later found difficult to deal with consistently. The first census was completed in 1884 as well. 53 resident members, enumerated by name, age, occupation. The occupation column for most of them read farmer, which was technically true and entirely inadequate as a description. The school operated through 1884 and 1885. Hannah taught through both years, though the enrollment declined as several families began to consider other options. In 1886, one family relocated to Newport. In 1887, 2 more followed. The shared labor arrangements, the communal planting and harvest that had been the economic backbone of the mountain for 70 years, began to break down, not because anyone decided to stop doing them, but because the new legal arrangement of private parcels introduced exactly the incentive structure that Caleb Hensley had predicted. If the land was yours, you worked it for yourself, and the accounting of who owed what to the communal pool became complicated, and complicated things have a way of becoming optional. The school closed in 1888. Hannah was 63 by then and tired, and the 3 families remaining on the summit couldn't provide enough children to justify the formal structure. She continued teaching informally for 2 more years, to whoever's children were available, and then she stopped because there were not enough children left. She died in 1893 on the summit, one of the last people to remain year-round on Bald Mountain. The community had not so much ended as dispersed. People had drifted down to the lowlands over the course of a decade, finding work in the growing economy of the valley towns, following the manufactured goods and the cash economy and the scale that Tobias had warned about since 1866. Tobias himself had gone to Newport in 1890 at the age of 75 to live with a grandchild. He was interviewed by the newspaper journalist there in 1887, and those interview notes are one of the primary sources for what happened on the mountain. He spoke clearly and without self-pity about what the community had been and what had happened to it. He said, "We built a thing that worked. Most things built by people don't work. That it didn't last forever is a sorrow, but not a shame." He died in Newport in 1891. Caleb Hensley was the last to go in 1896. He had stayed on Bald Mountain for 13 years after the survey, working his registered parcel alone when his family finally left, maintaining the council house even when there was no council left to meet in it. He swept the floor of the circle. he kept the foundation stones clear of encroaching laurel. He was, in those years, a man maintaining the form of something whose substance had departed, and it is hard to know whether that was stubborn or dignified or some combination of the two that doesn't have a simple name. When he finally left, he did something that no one who later visited the mountain understood until Clemens, who had heard about it through the network of county officials, recognized it and recorded it. He placed a single flat stone in the center of the circle. Not a chair, not an altar, just a stone, flat-topped, the size of a seat. In the center of the circle that Josiah had designed to have no center, the seat from which no one presided, he placed a stone that marked the absence of the thing that had been there. Whether this was grief or accusation, Clemens never decided. He went back to Bald Mountain twice in his later years. The second time was in 1901, when he was 59 and had been a school teacher in Newport for 12 years, having resigned from the tax assessor position in the fall of 1883. 3 months after he came back from the mountain the first time. He had written to his wife Margaret from Nashville, after his meeting with the governor's deputy, a letter that she kept and that their son eventually donated to the County Historical Society. The letter described what he had seen and what he thought about it, in language that was more personal than his official report, less careful, more honest. The difference between what you write for the record and what you write for the person who knows you. He described the council house and the school and Hannah's teaching and Tobias's arguments and the library with its 200 books. He described the vote, 31 to 29, and what it meant. He described Caleb Hensley's face when the vote was announced. And then, at the end of the letter, he wrote, "I went to collect taxes from people who owe nothing to a government that has done nothing for them. I came back wondering which of us is truly governed and which is truly free." He taught school in Newport for 23 years. He was, by all accounts, a good teacher, methodical and careful, as he had always been, but also genuinely interested in his students in a way that surprised people who had known him as an assessor. He was not a demonstrative man, and he never wrote publicly about Bald Mountain or his experience there. But former students remembered, decades later, that he sometimes talked about Locke and Paine in his classes, and that when he did, he had a particular quality of attention, as if he was not summarizing someone else's argument, but reporting something he had seen with his own eyes. The road through the valley below Bald Mountain was built in 1891. It improved commerce and communication and access to the county seat. It was, by the standards of county development, a success. By 1900, the valley below the mountain had 3 new businesses and a post office and regular mail service and the slow, accumulating benefits of connection to the larger economy that the road represented. By 1900, Bald Mountain itself was empty. The forest reclaimed the terraced gardens within a decade. The cabins fell slowly, not dramatically. Wood and weather working together in the way they always do when humans stop maintaining the things they've built. The smokehouse lasted longest, for reasons that local people who occasionally went up the mountain in subsequent years couldn't account for and didn't try to. The library schoolhouse was gone by 1910, collapsed under a winter snow load with the books inside it. 200 volumes soaked and frozen and rotted until they were unrecoverable. The mill house foundation is still visible if you know where to look. The council house is still there. The foundation stones have survived every winter for 140 years. They're granite, and granite doesn't apologize to weather. The circle they form is still 30 feet across, still without a head position, every stone still facing the center. The laurel had tried to grow over them and been cut back, and then tried again, and been cut back again, and eventually, whoever was doing the cutting stopped coming, and the laurel moved in. But the stones themselves are solid. They sit in their circle on the summit of a 6,000-foot mountain in Cocke County, Tennessee, and they have outlasted the community that placed them and the government that ended that community, and the generation that did both. The flat stone in the center, Caleb Hensley's addition, the stone that marks the absence, is still there too, half buried now under decades of leaf litter and the patient accumulation of mountain soil. If you dig a little, which some people have done over the years, you can find it. The surface is smooth on top, smooth in the specific way of a stone that was chosen because it was flat enough to sit on, though no one has sat on it in 125 years. There is a question that the history of Bald Mountain poses, and that the history of Bald Mountain does not answer. And it is worth sitting with the question for a moment rather than reaching for the answer, because the answer is not as simple as the question makes it seem. The question is, was what happened to this community justice or loss? The state's case, made in the careful language of official reports and policy memos, is that no community can exist indefinitely outside the legal order of the nation-state. That taxation is the price of common infrastructure. That a community without external legal accountability has no protection against its own worst tendencies. That the blank space on the map is a practical problem for governance, and a theoretical problem for the premise of democratic equality. These arguments are not cynical. They reflect genuine principles about how large, diverse societies maintain themselves, principles that are defensible on their own terms. The community's case, made in Josiah's original design, and in Tobias's pragmatic arguments, and in Caleb Hensley's last speech to the council, and in Clemens's letter to his wife, is that a community of 60 people, governing themselves by consensus for 70 years, educating their children better than the county could manage, managing land communally, without accumulating poverty, resolving disputes without prisons or executions, had achieved something real and worth protecting. That the state's claim to authority over them was asserted, not earned. That the instrument by which the community was finally ended, private property registration, was not neutral administration, but a deliberate dissolution, and that the question of whether a human community has the right to exist outside the state is not settled just because the state says it isn't. These arguments are also not cynical. They also reflect genuine principles that are defensible on their own terms. The tragedy of Bald Mountain is not that one side was wrong. The tragedy is that both sides were right about the things they were right about, and that rightness, in the end, didn't matter as much as power. The state had roads, and the Census Bureau, and the State Guard, and the legal instrument of property registration, and the slow, systematic patience of an institution that doesn't have to win quickly, because it will still exist after the people it's arguing with are dead. The community on Bald Mountain had consensus governance and a library, and a school, and 70 years of functional self-determination, and a vote of 31 to 29 that chose negotiation over continued refusal. The 31 were not foolish. They were realistic. They were accepting what Tobias had known since he marched through Virginia in 1863. That individual autonomy, even the communal autonomy of 60 people on a mountain, cannot survive organized state power if that state power decides to be serious about it. The decision to negotiate was the decision of people who understood their situation clearly and chose the path that preserved the most of what mattered for the longest possible time. The 29 were not wrong either. Caleb Hensley was right that the door, once opened, would let everything out. He was right that private property registration would unravel the communal system. He was right that within a generation, the community would be gone. He was right in the way that people who lose are sometimes right, comprehensively, accurately, and too late to matter. Hannah Ramsey's memoir fragment, the portion that survived a water leak in the County Historical Society in 1952, ends mid-sentence in the middle of a description of the council house, a description she was apparently writing from memory in her old age. Sometime in the late 1880s or early 1890s, trying to set down the physical details of the place before they slipped away from her. The last legible line reads, "The stones face inward, all of them, every stone toward the center," which was the shape of the thing we were trying to be. Not a line with someone at the head of it, but a circle with everyone at the edge of the same distance from the middle, so that the middle belonged to... The sentence does not complete. We don't know what the middle belonged to. We can guess. Everyone, perhaps, which was Josiah's answer, or no one, which was a different kind of answer, or the conversation itself, which is maybe what any genuine democracy actually is when it's working. Not a place where the powerful decide and the rest consent, but a space that belongs to the act of people talking seriously about how to live together, a space that exists only as long as the talking does. The foundation stones of the council house are still on the summit. They are hard to get to. The old trail is grown over, and the mountain is steep, and the laurel is thick. But they are there, sitting in their 30-foot circle, every stone facing the center, the way Josiah designed them in 1815, because he believed that the shape of a room teaches people what to do in it. The Tennessee State Guard does not maintain them. The County Historical Society has a record of them, but no budget for their preservation. The Cherokee National Forest, which now includes most of the Great Smoky Range in this part of Tennessee, lists them in a database of historical features as stone foundation, circular, approximate date 1815 to 1883, cultural significance, limited documentation. Limited documentation. 60 people governed themselves by genuine consensus for 70 years on a mountain in Cocke County, Tennessee. They educated their children. They managed their land communally without accumulating poverty. They turned back 36 tax collectors and 2 Confederate conscription parties and 1 Union recruitment drive and 1 set of Confederate bushwhackers. They argued about Locke and Paine and the nature of legitimate authority in a library of 200 books on a 6,000-foot summit. They voted, at the end, 31 to 29, and Caleb Hensley's face when the vote was read was the face of someone watching something that cannot be unwatched. Horace Clemens resigned his county position and became a school teacher and lived until 1912 and never stopped thinking about what he had seen in April of 1883. He wrote about it once, in a letter, and then did not write about it again. He taught school. He was methodical and careful and genuinely interested in his students, and sometimes he talked about Locke and Paine with the specific attention of a man describing something he had witnessed rather than something he had read. He died in 1912 at the age of 70. His wife Margaret had predeceased him by 4 years, which he apparently found an injustice of the first order. Their son, who donated the letter to the Historical Society, wrote in the accompanying note that his father had gone up Bald Mountain as a tax collector and come back as something he couldn't quite name, but that had made him, for the rest of his life, ask a question that most people don't think to ask. Not, is the government effective, or is the government legitimate in the formal legal sense, but something harder and simpler. Does this system of authority deserve what it claims? The question is still there, like the stones on the summit, like the flat rock in the center of the circle, half buried in leaf litter and mountain soil, waiting for whoever comes next and has the patience to look. The mountain is still there too, 6,000 feet, give or take, in the Great Smoky Range of East Tennessee, visible on clear days from the French Broad River Valley as a rounded, bald shape against the sky. The kind of summit that looks simple from a distance and reveals its complexity only when you're on it. In October, it catches the first light in the county. In February, it holds the snow longest. In April, when the laurel blooms, and the hemlock greens, and the trail that is no longer quite a trail suggests itself upward through the undergrowth, it looks from the right angle and at the right hour of the morning, like something that is waiting. Not for a tax collector, not for a survey party, not for any of the official purposes that the outside world has ever thought to send up its slopes. Just waiting. The way stone waits, the way a circle waits, the way an unanswered question waits when the people who were trying to answer it have had to go somewhere else. And the conversation they were having is still, technically, unfinished.